So we have in the Magian consciousness structure a definite beginning and a definite ending of time. And notice that in the mythical consciousness structure, I've suggested that we should think of this as a sort of mythical consciousness phase 2, but it differs from the mythical consciousness structure. It retains from it this distinction between the macro soul and the micro soul, but it faces what it changes, what its innovation is this idea that history is not cyclical. The mythical consciousness structure sees history as an endless repetition of becoming, without end, over and over, whirling in the Babylonian Sumerian cosmos with the cycles of time whirling endlessly, in the Hindu vision, in which it's brought to a grand apotheosis of all the yugas cycling through endlessly. The Magian innovation that's different from the first generation of the mythical consciousness structure is to have a definite historical sensibility, to bring to this mythical consciousness a sense of a definite beginning and a definite ending. And it basically then thinks of time as itself cavern-like. It creates a parabolic arc of unfolding that gives it its sense of a definite beginning and gives to everything that happens within history a sense of authentic singularity. Everything that happens at this time, at this point, and is never going to be repeated again. That's unique. We get our historical consciousness from the Levant, from this Levantine Magian transformation. So then Spengler moves on to talk about, he shifts back actually to a diachronic, from a synchronic structuralist analysis to a diachronic mode again, and starts reviewing back, going back over what the unfolding of the culture looked like. So he says then, to recap, basically we have in about 700 BC, then we have from 700 BC to 300 BC, we have the unfolding of the prophetic religions in East and West. In East we get the Zoroastrian Persian transformations. In the West we get Amos and Hosea and Isaiah and Jeremiah. We get the big prophetic traditions. And also at the same time the Chaldean, Babylonian astronomical traditions. All this is happening in those centuries. Then he says from about 300 BC down to about the year 0, we move into the apocalyptic period, in which we get the great apocalyptic text, the book of Ezekiel, the Zendavesta in the Eastern transformations, and we get the book of Daniel and 1 Enoch, and then down to 2 Esdras in the book of Revelation. And of course the book of Revelation was originally a Hebrew text that some Christian had simply Christianized, inherited and Christianized by glossing it over and adding certain structural features to it. But we know that it was originally a Hebrew text. Apocalypticism is very something that originates amongst the Hebrews. And so then long, he says, a third upheaval comes, long about the time of Caesar, with the invention then. The soul comes to a great awakening, and we get the creation of all the different soteriological religions, all the cults and religions of salvation. And it's at this time that we get the creation, the writing down of the Gospels as a kind of creation of a national epos, this is the epic phase of civilization that corresponds in our civilization to the creation of the writing down about the year 1000 of the Icelandic sagas, and then down to 1200 with the Arthurian romances. Then in Hindu civilization, this is the period of the Rig Veda and the Indo-Aryan hero tales associated with the deeds of Indra, the dragon-slaying deeds of Indra. This is the great period of the romances, the creation of the Homeric mythos. This is the period of all the great gospel romances, whether we're talking about the Mandeans or whether we're talking about the creation of Mithraism, or whether we're talking about the Gnostic texts. We get in all of this period the creation of the sufferings of a redeemer, an anthropos figure who descends and suffers the metabolisms and transformations of being incarnate in time. And this becomes the basic, all of these texts, whether we're talking about the Corpus Hermeticum or even the Sibylline oracles from this period, or the late classical romances of Apollonius of Tyana, these are all transformations of a messianic figure who is a sufferer, redeemer figure who dies and is reborn. And this is the basic period of the epos, the creation of a great myth in the grand style. Then he says, starting with the John Gospel about the year 100 AD and moving on into the at about the end of the 2nd century, we get the shift into early scholasticism with the rise of the Gnostics such as Valentinus and Bardesanes and Marcion, we get the equivalent to the Western early scholastics, Abelard and Anselm and Aquinas. We get the rise of the application of intellect now to the early purely mythological forms. This corresponds in India to the shift from the Rig Veda, the Vedas, the four Vedas, to the Upanishads, in the Homeric tradition to the rise of the pre-Socratic philosophers, from the Homeric to the pre-Socratic philosophers. That is analogous to this shift now from the Gospels and biblical texts to the Church Fathers, Origen and Clement, Iamblichus and Plotinus. These are the great scholastic figures in which, and it's a basic morphology in each one of these civilizations where you have a shift from the great myth of the springtime epics to the application of intellect, to a translation into the language of verbal discourse, of what the implications of the original mythic imagination, the creation of a mythic world picture, were. It now begins to be analyzed. And so Spengler says we move into the period in Magian civilization of these scholastics. Clement and Origen, Tertullian, the last Tannaim up to Rabbi Jehuda, who completes the Mishnah, the Neo-Pythagoreans and Hermetics of Alexandria. All of these correspond, of course, in the West to Joachim of Florus and Bernard of Clairvaux.